What would you think if I told you that some men aren't captivated by beauty, but by the mirror you unconsciously become, the one that reflects back the parts of him he's been avoiding his whole life? Not your charm, not your body, not even your soul, but the shadow you awaken in him, simply by being a woman who doesn't flinch in the presence of darkness. There's a book, old and unassuming on the outside, yet wrapped in myth and mystery, like a forbidden lover. Its pages do not seduce the ego, they provoke it. They do not flatter the persona, no, they dismantle it with surgical precision. This is the book that whispered to his shadow while his conscious mind slept, the one that made him feel seen in a way he couldn't articulate, only crave. And when he first met her, she moved like a living page from that book. Not innocent, not naive, but naked in truth. She had read the lines between the lines, the ones not written in ink, but in ache. She was not interested in taming a man's demons. She was fluent in them. Hers had taught her to read energy like scripture. She did not run from emotional volatility. She translated it. She did not recoil at wounded masculinity. She listened for the boy underneath, crying in a dialect most women never dared to hear. And in that sacred stillness, something stirred inside him. A memory, a mirror, a madness. She didn't offer him safety. She offered him a reckoning. And that is precisely why he couldn't stay away. To the untrained eye, it looked like obsession. But it was possession of another kind. His shadow saw hers. And like two spirits buried in flesh, they recognized the battlefield they once shared. A battlefield of abandonment, of rage disguised as silence, of longing dressed up as lust. He thought he was drawn to her for her softness, but it was her sovereignty that undid him, because sovereignty, to a man who has not yet met his own, is intoxicating, terrifying, addictive. She didn't feed his ego, she starved it. She didn't need him to rescue her. She wanted him to resurrect himself. This was the seduction he never saw coming. He had been worshipped before. He had been needed, desired, even adored. But this was different. She didn't try to impress him. She mirrored him. She made him feel like a god and a ghost in the same breath. And slowly, the illusions began to crack. Because what Jung knew, and what this woman embodied, is that the real dance between masculine and feminine isn't about dominance or submission. It's about recognition. He saw in her what he buried in himself, the part that longed to be free from performance, the boy who never learned to cry, the man who wore achievement like armor and mistook attention for affection. And when she looked at him, really looked, he felt like a fraud. Not because she judged him, but because her presence exposed everything he pretended not to be. This is why the book is dangerous. Because once you've tasted this kind of reflection, mediocre mirrors no longer suffice. You begin to crave depth over devotion, mystery over manageability. You begin to realize that most of what you've called love was a transaction between wounds. She didn't want his promise. She wanted his presence. And presence, for a man haunted by shadow, is the hardest thing to give. So he ran, not from her but from himself. Because when a man is seduced by his shadow, he either evolves or escapes. There is no in-between, and she didn't chase. Because a woman who walks with her own darkness doesn't beg for company in the light. She knows. If he returns, it will not be because she softened her power. It will be because he rose to meet it. This is the paradox of true feminine energy. It does not pursue, it pulls. It does not demand, it disarms. And it does not seduce through body or mind alone. It seduces through mirror. Not a reflection of his perfection, but of his potential. And the shadow? The shadow sees it first. Some say he forgot her, that the silence meant apathy. But those who've ever been truly seen, those whose souls were stripped bare before another human being, know that forgetting is not forgetting. It's suppression. It's psychological exile. It's what the ego does when it cannot handle the confrontation of the soul. In the quiet nights when the mask slips and the phone screen fades, he remembers. Not her perfume, not her laughter. He remembers the way she made him feel like a man and a myth all at once. Because she wasn't impressed by his trophies. She was intrigued by his terrors. She didn't flinch when he showed her the versions of himself that even he couldn't look at without flinching. That's what made her unforgettable. Not her beauty, not her brilliance, but her refusal to collude with his illusions. That is what happens when the shadow is seduced, not with flattery, but with truth. And truth is the ultimate aphrodisiac. Carl Jung knew it. He knew that love is not found in the polished, predictable spaces. It lives in the caverns, in the chaos, in the confrontation between who you thought you were and who you really are when stripped of validation. She was a siren of psychological depth, a priestess of projection, a mirror so brutally honest that to stand in her presence was to face everything you've spent your life avoiding. No wonder she felt dangerous. She was, to the ego, to the persona, to the delicate web of stories we build to survive, but eventually suffocate in. He never saw it coming, because nothing in this world prepares a man for a woman who sees without needing to possess. A woman who can walk away without wounding, who doesn't cry to be chosen, because she already chose herself. She had done the work, the deep, dirty, devastating work. The kind of work where you meet your own shadow, not with judgment, but with fierce compassion. Where you learn to mother your own unmet needs, to father your own fragile sense of safety. Where you crawl through the underworld of your psyche and come out not healed, but whole. And once you are whole, you no longer accept fragments disguised as love. That was her power. Not in what she offered, but in what she refused. And her refusal was a revolution. Because she had learned what most women are never taught, that to be irresistible is not to be perfect, but to be present with your own pain. To hold it like a weapon and a wound. To seduce not with skin, but with soul. To say, this is me, unmasked, unedited. If you cannot meet me here, don't ask for my heart. So when he came to her, cloaked in charisma but dripping in disconnection, she smiled. Not because she was impressed, but because she recognized the archetype. The man addicted to admiration but allergic to intimacy. The man who could conquer a boardroom but not his own reflection. The man whose charm was not a gift, but a guardrail. She didn't fight him. She didn't fix him. She mirrored him. And that was enough to unravel his foundations. Because the feminine, in her truest form, doesn't demand transformation. She invites it, but only the brave accept. The rest retreat, blaming the mirror for what it reflects. And so he ran. Because that is what the unconscious does when faced with radical truth. It flees, cloaked in rationalizations, masked as logic. But the wound remains. Festering in the dark, whispering in the quiet, pulling him back to the memory of her presence like a drug he both craves and fears. You've known a woman like this, or perhaps you are her, the one who loved without losing herself, who walked away not in weakness, but in wisdom, who understood that loving someone doesn't mean lowering yourself to be palatable to their fear. You held up the mirror and watched him flinch. And still you stayed soft, still you stayed sacred, still you stayed sovereign, because that is what the awakened woman does. She becomes the book he was never ready to read, one he cannot forget no matter how far he runs, and maybe one day he will return, not to reclaim her, but to reclaim himself. But not all returns are meant to reunite. Sometimes they are rites of passage, a quiet reckoning between what was lost and what was learned. For a man to reclaim himself after encountering a woman who reflected his shadow, he must first walk the scorched path of accountability, not the performative kind, the kind that splits his inner world open like a temple collapsing under the weight of hidden sins. That is the hidden violence of awakening. It does not flatter the ego. It annihilates it. And what remains? A trembling boy wrapped in a man's body, holding all the wounds he never admitted to having, the abandonment he dismissed, the shame he buried beneath degrees and dominance, the loneliness he drowned in conquest. But there is a strange mercy in this devastation, because it is only when the mask is cracked that the face beneath can finally breathe. Carl Jung warned us, the shadow is not evil, it is just unseen. What we repress does not disappear. It festers, it corrupts, and eventually it commands. The man who avoids his darkness becomes enslaved by it, unknowingly projecting it onto the women who dare to love him. He calls her too much when she asks for depth, crazy when she demands congruence, cold when she withdraws to protect her boundaries. Yet beneath those judgments is fear, because the woman who has befriended her own shadow cannot be manipulated by his. She sees, and to be seen by such a woman is not flattering. It is terrifying, because it calls forth a standard his ego was never built to meet. But if he stays, if he endures the burning, he may just be reborn. Not in her arms, but in his own reflection, because no woman can rescue a man from his shadow. She can only show him the mirror. He must choose to look, to lean in, to unmake the man the world taught him to be, and become the man his soul remembers. This is the sacred violence of intimacy. It is not soft. It is not safe. It is not a lullaby. It is an invocation, a sacred summoning of all the forgotten gods within. And for the woman who has tasted this kind of love, the raw, unfiltered, psychic kind, there is no going back. No taste for games, no tolerance for breadcrumbs, no interest in being admired by men who cannot sit still with their own silence. She has walked the underworld. She has danced with demons. She has cradled the broken parts of herself in the dark and whispered, "You are still worthy." What can the ordinary offer her now? Validation? She is her own mirror. Attention? Her presence is its own applause. Pursuit? She is not a prize to be won. She is a threshold to be crossed. And only those with warrior hearts and poet souls will ever dare enter. If you are such a woman, you know this ache. The ache of being too real in a world that rewards performance. The ache of being the lesson, not the fantasy. The ache of being remembered not for the pleasure you gave, but for the truth you revealed. You are not unloved. You are unforgettable, because you were never here to be consumed. You were here to awaken. And yes, awakening is lonely, often brutal, because those who can meet you in that sacred space are rare. But don't shrink. Don't edit. Don't dim your knowing to make others comfortable in their slumber. Your fire is not destruction. It is illumination. And in time, someone will arrive who does not fear the flames, who does not recoil at your intensity, your knowing, your know, who will not just admire your light, but sit reverently in your shadows. Until then, protect your energy like a temple. Walk away from half-loves. Speak only to souls that echo. And never forget, the woman who knows her own depths becomes the measuring stick for every man's courage. If he cannot meet you there, let him go. Not in anger, in honor. Because you are not a chapter in his story. You are the book he was too afraid to finish. And while some may turn away, too timid, too unequipped, too deeply tangled in illusions, you must not. Because your path, as painful as it may be, is the sacred pilgrimage of the initiated. You are not cursed for your depth. You are chosen for it. For the feminine that has integrated her shadow is not soft in the way society defines softness. She is soft like velvet hiding a blade. She does not flinch at discomfort. She does not collapse when love is withheld. Her softness is strength in its final form, yielding only where truth resides. She becomes an oracle of inner reality, and men sense it. They may not understand why, but they feel it, that she is no longer governed by the same rules, that she will not contort for crumbs, that she will not participate in the theater of ego games, that she is no longer asking to be seen. She is the seeing. The man who still wears his shadow as a mask will find her intolerable, because in her gaze, he meets every part of himself he spent a lifetime avoiding, not through judgment, but through the absence of illusion. And that absence is his undoing. Because the empowered feminine does not punish, she reveals. And for the man who is not ready, revelation feels like ruin. But some men, some are ready. They have bled enough, lost enough, lied to themselves long enough. They have stood at the edge of the abyss and whispered, "There has to be more than this." And in that whisper, a new kind of man is born. Not the performer, but the poet. Not the hunter, but the holder. Not the controller, but the conscious creator. When such a man meets a woman in her integrated wholeness, he does not shrink. He steadies. He listens to the music beneath her silence. He respects her solitude without resenting it. He understands that her boundaries are not walls, but sacred rites of passage. That to truly touch her is to be transformed. Because this woman is no longer impressed by potential. She is not seduced by charm. She is not enchanted by temporary highs. She waits for depth, not in stillness, but in sovereign motion. She becomes her own compass, her own home, her own legend. And this changes everything. She no longer chases meaning in the eyes of another. She carves it from her own rib. She no longer performs femininity to attract love. She embodies divinity to be love. She no longer demands loyalty. She evokes it. Because to betray her would be to betray the divine itself. Some will call her intimidating, but what they truly mean is she cannot be controlled. Some will say she's too much, but what they truly mean is she reflects everything I've yet to face. Some will say she's lonely, but what they fail to understand is she is not alone. She is in solitude. And solitude for the awakened is sacred. It is the garden where she meets her soul and listens, where she remembers her origin before she was taught to forget, where she sings to the shadows and calls them by name. And perhaps this is the truest kind of beauty, not one that begs to be noticed, but one that dares to know itself, a beauty that refuses to be tamed or traded, that lives not in the surface, but in the soul. So if you, woman of fire and silence, are walking this path, know this: you are not too much. You are exactly enough for the man who has done the work, the one who sees the blood on your altar and bows, not in worship, but in respect. Until then, hold your fire. Burn only what no longer serves. Tend your temple. Speak your truth. Refuse to be diluted, because you are not here to be understood by all. You are here to be remembered by the few who have dared to feel. And when they arrive, you will not need to explain your worth. You will simply stand in it. And so she stands, barefoot on the ashes of her former selves, wrapped not in apology but in awareness. The woman who once bent for approval has become the axis around which reality begins to shift. No longer a reaction, she is now a force, silent, seismic, sacred. She is the echo of every suppressed voice, the breath beneath every stifled scream, the lineage of women who burned, some in silence, some on stakes, but never in vain. Within her veins flows the blood of the silenced, the wild, the wise. And she knows. Her pain was not punishment. It was passage. This is what the shadow teaches her. Not how to be palatable, but how to be whole. It whispers, you were never meant to be soft in a world that feeds on suppression. You were meant to be real. Even if real meant raw, rageful, unrelenting. And here lies the truth no pretty quote will tell you. Healing is not a sunrise. It is a funeral. You bury illusions. You cremate dependency. You stand weeping at the grave of the girl who thought love meant shrinking. And then, with trembling hands, you plant seeds in the soil of your own becoming. Because after the shadow, you don't emerge clean, you emerge clear. You no longer need others to mirror back your worth. You carry it in the way you walk away. In the silence you do not rush to fill. In the love you no longer beg to receive. You become dangerous, not because you wish to hurt, but because you refuse to betray yourself to soothe someone else's wounds. And the world senses it. Suddenly, those who once fed on your doubt find themselves starved. Those who tried to tame your magic now face a woman who casts her own spells. And the men who only knew how to conquer stand confused before a woman who cannot be claimed, only met. This is not rebellion, this is remembrance of the wild woman before conditioning, of the priestess before performance, of the empress before exile. In Jungian terms, she has individuated, not by becoming someone new, but by peeling back every false layer and returning to what was always hers: sovereignty. And here's the paradox. The more whole she becomes, the less she needs anyone, and the more sacred her connections become. Because now love is not a transaction, it is a transformation. Not a distraction, it is a devotion. She no longer falls in love, she rises in it. She does not dissolve into romance, she expands through it. And any man who approaches her must first walk through the fire of his own shadow, for she will not water herself down to soothe his fragility. He must come not to possess, but to partner. Not to impress, but to witness. Not to fix her, but to feel her. Because this woman has learned. The masculine that has not faced his shadow will see her power as a threat. But the man who has stared into his own darkness will see her radiance as an invitation. And this is where the true union begins. Not in fantasy, but in fire. Not in control, but in consciousness. Not in saving, but in seeing. The kind of seeing that says, I see your darkness and I do not flinch. I see your light and I do not worship. I see all of you and I choose to honor. It is this kind of love that she now holds space for. Until then, she is not waiting. She is becoming. Every breath, a reclamation. Every boundary, a blessing. Every scar, a scripture. She does not ask for the world to change. She changes, and the world has no choice but to respond. And in that response, a new reality is born. Not the one she was given, but the one she now dares to create. Because the woman who has met her shadow no longer plays by the old rules. She writes her own. She writes them in blood and breath and the quiet of midnight reckonings. Her life is no longer a script passed down from generations of obedient women. It is a spell she casts each morning, not to be pleasing, but to be present, not to be beautiful, but to be blazing. She doesn't seek perfection, she seeks permission from no one but herself. And the most radical thing she ever did was choose to exist fully, without apology, without trimming her truth, without sacrificing her soul on the altar of acceptance. That is the final alchemy of the shadow. It doesn't destroy, it illuminates. For too long, women have been taught to fear their own depth, to fear being too much, too loud, too angry, too emotional, too intelligent, too sensual, too ambitious, as if intensity were a curse and passion a disease. But in the ancient language of the psyche, too much is code for undeniably powerful. She was never too much. She was simply more than the world was prepared to hold. But now she has become her own container, her own witness, her own refuge. And within that sacred solitude, she births a truth that shakes the foundation of every fragile structure that once tried to contain her. She doesn't need to be understood to be undeniable. She doesn't need to be chosen to be valuable. She doesn't need to be wanted to be whole. For the woman who has read Jung's book not with her eyes but with her soul knows this. the shadow was never her enemy. It was her exiled twin, the one who held all her rage, her knowing, her divine erotic fire, the one who whispered through her nightmares, who sabotaged the wrong relationships, who pulled her into breakdowns not to destroy her, but to deliver her. The shadow was the love that refused to lie. It told her, "You are not broken. You are bound. Bound to illusions. Bound to inherited guilt. Bound to a legacy of survival dressed up as femininity." And the book she read, maybe on a rainy Tuesday, maybe in the middle of a heartbreak, didn't offer solutions. It offered mirrors. Some so shattering she almost dropped them. Some so holy she wept just touching the page. Because when you begin to see your shadow clearly, it stops lurking. It starts leading. And she followed, not blindly but bravely, through the aching forests of her family's unspoken traumas, through the labyrinth of relationships where she lost herself in being the good one, through the wastelands of waiting for permission to begin. She followed, not knowing where it would end, but knowing that anything was better than the numbness of pretending. And here's the truth. Shadow work is not cute. It's not an Instagram caption. It is excruciating. It is ecstatic. It is exiling. And it is exactly what she needed to finally become herself. Because no amount of love, attention, or adoration can fill the void left by a woman who has abandoned her own fire. And no amount of external validation can heal the inner betrayal of constantly playing small to make others comfortable. So now, when they ask why she's different, why her eyes carry storms, and her silence feels like a spell, she smiles. Because they don't see the years it took to become this free. The nights spent drowning in grief, not her own. The times she set herself on fire to keep someone else warm. The rituals she created to summon back her scattered soul. They see the queen. They forget the crucifixion, but she remembers, and she bows to it. Because the woman who walks in her truth no longer fears loss. She fears self-abandonment. She doesn't mistake chaos for passion, or silence for peace. She doesn't trade her boundaries for crumbs of affection. She has learned to feel deeply is not weakness. It is warfare. And to walk away without closing the door gently is sometimes the most sacred act of self-respect. So now she chooses, not from a place of hunger, not from a place of fear, but from the firelit temple of her own becoming. And those who meet her there must know, they are not approaching a damsel waiting to be saved. They are standing before a woman who saved herself with bare hands and bloodied knees and a heart that refused to die. The woman who knows her worth doesn't chase. She chooses.